On a lonely mountain road, as the last light faded, a man slammed his brakes. Two wild kittens were standing upright in his headlights, their tiny bodies trembling, paws raised in silent desperation. At first, he thought it was just hunger or fear. But as he stepped closer, he realized these weren't ordinary strays begging for food. Their eyes pleaded for help, something deeper, more urgent. What he discovered after following them would leave him shaken and change his life forever. A hidden tragedy and a test of compassion that would touch every heart that heard the tale. Before we dive in, make sure to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support helps these true stories reach even more animal lovers. Late afternoon settled like a hush across the winding mountain road, the kind that clings to the Sierra Nevada ridges with white-knuckled bends and hairpin turns. Shadows stretched long over the cracked pavement, spilled from pine and fir, swallowing patches of golden light, until the world itself felt suspended between day and night. Mark gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, the window half down so the mountain air could wash over him. He'd just left his father's house, a small, drafty place clinging to the edge of a clearing. The kind of home where silence pressed against the walls. His father's words echoed, stubborn as old roots. "Don't let life pass by without leaving a mark." The phrase had circled Mark's mind the whole drive. It felt heavier now than ever, as if the road itself demanded some answer. His eyes drifted between the sloping sun, the ribbon of pavement, the memory of his father's trembling hands. Every so often, he would look up at the ridgelines, wonder how long he could keep this up, living with one foot in someone else's past, the other on roads that led only deeper into solitude. The world out here was a hush of cicadas, distant bird calls, and the constant hum of his own doubts. Mark slowed for a tight curve, the tires whispering against gravel, the guardrail a thin promise between him and empty air. He barely noticed the way the sun was sinking, until the light fractured on the windshield and something moved in the road ahead. A flicker of color, so fast it could have been a trick of the dying light. He blinked. The blur darted across the asphalt, tawny, quick, gone in a heartbeat. His instincts took over. He slammed the brakes, jerked the wheel, the car fishtailing dangerously close to the cliff's edge. Dust exploded in the rear view, pebbles rattled against the undercarriage. For one long, heart-hammering second, Mark thought the world might tilt and swallow him whole. But the car skidded to a stop, shuddering. Mark's breath came in short, sharp bursts. His hands shook on the wheel, and he pressed his forehead against the steering column, letting the fear drain out one trembling exhale at a time. He opened his eyes slowly. The dust began to settle, painting the road in a soft haze. That's when he saw them. Not one, but two tiny forms, barely more than shadows on the shoulder. At first, he thought they were wild rabbit kits, or maybe just tricks of dusk and exhaustion. But as the dust thinned, their shapes sharpened. Two kittens, wild and impossibly small, huddled in the edge of light and shadow. But it wasn't their size that froze him. Both stood upright on their hind legs, trembling, their front paws raised like children in silent prayer. Their eyes, wild, golden, unblinking, locked on him, wide as moons. Not a sound escaped them, but their bodies quivered with something ancient and raw. Fear, yes, but also a desperate kind of hope. The world felt impossibly still. Mark's heart thundered, caught between instinct and awe. He'd spent years drafting blueprints, sketching lines, calculating angles, But nothing in his life had prepared him for the haunted plea written in the stance of these wild creatures. Time itself seemed to slow until there was nothing left but the fading sun, the hush of the forest, and two trembling kittens with nowhere else to turn. Mark reached for the door, the old hinges creaking into the silence. Somewhere behind him, the world kept spinning. But in that single, strange moment, fate set its hook. He would never be able to drive away from this road, nor from the haunting eyes that would follow him, long after the mountain shadows had claimed the day. Mark barely remembered stepping out of the car. One moment he was clutching the door handle, heart still hammering in his chest. The next, his boots crunched on loose gravel, the cool mountain air wrapping around him like a question. The silence was sharp, broken only by the soft, uncertain pulse of his own breath. He moved slowly, careful not to make a sound that might spook the wild kittens. Up close, their strangeness deepened. Both still stood on hind legs, tiny paws raised, trembling, not in threat, not in play, but in the unmistakable shape of a plea. The way their fur bristled and their eyes never blinked made Mark feel like he'd stumbled into someone else's dream. He had never seen an animal, let alone two wild ones, behave this way. As he took another step, one of the kittens dropped abruptly to all fours. Its tiny shoulders hunched, tail low, but its gaze never wavered. The other hesitated, then followed, their wild eyes flickering between Mark and the tree line beyond. They backed away, not in panic, but with a wary, deliberate patience, as if testing him. Mark's breath hitched. He stood perfectly still, waiting. The larger kitten took a tentative sniff of the air, its whiskers twitching, then let out a faint, almost inaudible mewl. There was a language here, older than words, written in fear and hope. Mark's mind raced for some logic to explain what he was seeing. Maybe these kittens had been raised near humans, learned tricks for scraps. But their coats were the rough color of stone and sun, their bodies lean with hunger, faces sharp with wildness. They didn't belong to anyone. They belonged only to this lonely stretch of woods and sky. Mark knelt slowly, lowering himself to their level, palms open at his sides. He tried to speak, but the words dried in his throat. The silence pressed in around him, heavy, charged. He felt the forest watching, measuring him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, almost as if the moment itself had broken, one kitten's head jerked toward a narrow gap in the tangled brush, a path barely visible, lost in shadows. The second kitten glanced back at Mark, then at the same spot, tail flicking in silent urgency. And then, with a final look over its shoulder, the larger one slipped into the undergrowth, vanishing in a whisper of grass and needles. The smaller followed, silent and quick, pausing just once to meet Mark's eyes, a flash of gold, gone in an instant. Mark hesitated, instinct screaming at him to let them go, to get back in his car and pretend none of this had happened. But that wild, desperate stance haunted him. These kittens weren't running from him. They were leading him. There was purpose in their strange behavior, a kind of primal message he couldn't ignore. He rose, brushing dust from his jeans, glancing at the empty road, then at the shadows swallowing the trail ahead. It was madness, he knew. Chasing wild animals into the deep woods at dusk, miles from help, alone except for the ghosts of his father's voice. But something in him refused to turn away. There are moments, he realized, when fate doesn't just knock. It drags you forward, whether you're ready or not. Mark closed the car door behind him with a soft click, locking away the last traces of safety and logic. His world had shrunk to the hush of pine needles, the fading warmth of sun on his back, and the promise of wild eyes flickering just ahead, somewhere between hope and fear. He followed, not because he understood, but because in that trembling, silent plea, he recognized something he hadn't felt in years. The wild calling for help, the world waiting for someone to answer, and this time he would not turn away. The last light of day faded quickly as Mark stepped off the pavement and into the waiting shadows of the trail. His car, his maps, every certainty of his world slipped away behind him, replaced by a hush that pressed in from all sides. The path was barely a path at all, just a thread of trampled needles winding through the dense undergrowth, the kind of trail made not by people, but by the careful passage of small, wary creatures. Mark hesitated only once, glancing back at his vehicle perched alone on the roadside, taillights still pulsing faintly. Then he pressed forward, following the silent invitation of those two wild kittens. The air here was different, colder, thicker, full of old secrets and the sharp scent of pine sap. Above, branches interlaced so tightly that dusk arrived early, washing the world in a dim, green gloom. He could barely see the kittens now, just flashes of movement. An ear, a tail, the briefest gleam of eyes catching what little light was left. They moved quickly, but always just ahead, never letting him lose them completely. Every so often, the smaller one would pause, glancing back as if to be sure he was still following. Then, satisfied, it slipped deeper into the tangled woods. Mark's senses stretched to the breaking point. Every rustle set his nerves jangling. Every distant snap of a twig made his breath catch. Shadows moved in the corners of his eyes. Maybe deer, maybe something else. He could feel his heart pounding, a steady drum in his chest, echoing the ancient fear that comes when humans step out of the world they control and into the wild's domain. He pushed aside branches, stumbled over roots, feeling more lost with every step. The woods felt alive, not welcoming, not hostile, just indifferent. An old wilderness that did not care who entered or why. The temperature dipped, the wind picked up, carrying with it the faintest cries of birds settling for the night. Somewhere, an owl called once, long and low. Mark's mind flashed with memories. A childhood hike gone wrong. The way his father once taught him to move quietly, to listen for the difference between the forest's usual song and something out of place. Now, every sound was out of place. Still, the trail pressed on. The kittens finally stopped at a bend where the trees grew thickest, the world beyond swallowed by brush and shadow. Mark paused, sucking in cold air, sweat running down his back. He wiped his palms on his jeans, realizing how alone he truly was. The realization prickled at the edges of his fear, but he pushed it down. He couldn't turn back. Not now. Not with those wild eyes still watching him. The smaller kitten circled a patch of ground, then sat, eyes fixed on Mark. Its sibling mirrored the movement, silent but insistent, a living signpost in the gloom. Mark stood still, his senses raw, heart still pounding. The woods around him held their breath. He realized then that he had crossed a line, not just off the road, but out of the world he knew, and into a place where he had no power, no plan. Every instinct told him to retreat, to run, to find light and safety. But something in those trembling, defiant little bodies anchored him. They needed him, or maybe, just maybe, He needed them. As the shadows deepened, Mark understood. He was no longer a spectator. He was part of the wild, silent story now, caught in a moment that could not be undone. The path behind had vanished. The only way left was forward, into whatever waited in the heart of the darkening woods. At the edge of the thicket, the kittens stopped. Their bodies were tight with tension, tails low, eyes shining wide in the last threads of dusk. Mark slowed, wiping sweat from his brow, his breath quick and sharp in the coldening air. For a moment, all he could hear was his own heartbeat, the quiet ticking of time lost deep in the woods. A foul stench drifted through the brush, sharp and unmistakable, a sickly mix of blood, old fur, and rust. Mark's stomach tightened. The kittens didn't run or hide. Instead, they hovered near a patch of tangled bramble, one of them letting out a thin, wavering cry. It was a sound that pierced the woods and made Mark's chest ache, a sound that belonged to heartbreak, not fear. He crouched down, brushing aside the brittle branches and matted grass, his fingers trembling. The smell hit him full, raw, and metallic. He nearly recoiled, but the pleading gaze of the kittens anchored him. Mark pushed deeper, the undergrowth clawing at his arms, and then, half hidden beneath a scatter of leaves and pine needles, he saw her. A lynx bigger than the kittens but still slender, her coat once golden, now dulled by dust and blood. She lay motionless, eyes half closed, one leg twisted grotesquely in the iron jaws of a rusted bear trap. The steel teeth bit deep into her flesh, the ground around her torn and gouged from the violence of her struggle. Her body bore the marks of desperate effort, raw patches where the fur was worn away, streaks of dried blood, a line of crushed earth where she'd tried to drag herself free. Mark's breath caught in his throat. The scene was cruel, savage, not nature's work, but man's. He had seen animal suffering before, a bird with a broken wing, a deer limping from a wound. But this was different. The trap was old, stained with rust, hidden to catch and kill anything unlucky enough to cross its path. Someone had set it here and left it. The lynx's life had been stolen not by hunger or storm, but by human cruelty, by greed and indifference. The kittens pressed close to their mother, mewling softly, their small bodies shaking. One nuzzled her neck, as if begging for warmth that would never return. The other pawed at the ground, eyes pleading with Mark, as if asking him to fix what could not be fixed. Grief and fury tangled inside him. He knelt in the dirt, fists clenched, teeth grinding. There was nothing left to do but bear witness to the cruelty. Mark whispered an apology he knew the lynx could not hear, his voice ragged with regret and shame. In that hollowed silence, the woods felt like a cathedral, echoing with loss, heavy with the weight of what could never be undone. The kittens didn't understand. They only knew their mother would not rise, that her warmth had faded, that the world had become colder and meaner than it should ever be. Their tiny cries carved through the dark, searing a memory into Mark's heart that he knew he would carry forever. He looked down at the trap, hatred burning in his chest. There was no misunderstanding here, no excuse. This was the work of careless hands, the kind that took from the world and left only suffering behind. The kittens circled their mother's body, refusing to leave her side. Mark pressed a shaking hand to his face, grief rising sharp and bitter. He realized he was not just lost in the woods. He was standing in the middle of someone else's pain, powerless to make it right. Night pressed in closer, thick with the scent of iron and sorrow. Mark knew this moment would change him. Some truths cannot be forgotten. Some wounds never heal. All that remained now was what he chose to do next, how to carry the weight of what he'd seen and what he would become in the shadow of this cruel truth. Mark knelt in the cold dirt, numb and hollow, the lynx's broken body beside him and the kittens pressing desperately against her side. Their small, ragged cries pulsed in the darkness, each sound a thread unraveling what was left of his composure. He reached out with a trembling hand, barely brushing the mother's fur, coarse, stiff, already losing its warmth. The trap's metal jaws were rusted but merciless, stained with blood that had dried in the fading light. He wanted to rage, to break something, to scream at the empty woods for what had been done. But all he could manage was a whisper, an apology, a promise, a plea to anyone listening. The kittens curled tighter, as if their mother's lifeless form could still shelter them from the cold and the hunger creeping in around the edges. Mark felt utterly helpless, swallowed by a grief that didn't belong to him, but had claimed him all the same. He fumbled for his phone, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. His thumb slid across the glass, searching desperately for a signal. One bar, then none, then nothing at all. The forest pressed in, thick with silence. Isolation settled over him like a weight. No help, no connection. Just a man, 2 orphans, and the cost of someone else's cruelty. A branch snapped behind him, a sharp crack that scattered the quiet like a thrown stone. Mark spun, heart pounding, eyes wide with fear and raw adrenaline. Out of the gloom stepped a figure, tall, weathered, silver-bearded, the kind of presence that seemed carved out of the mountains themselves. The stranger's coat was patched and stained, boots caked with years of mud. Slung over his shoulder, a battered hunting rifle caught the last faint trace of daylight. The man didn't speak right away. His eyes took in the scene. The lynx, the trap, the grieving kittens, Mark's helplessness. For a long moment, the air thrummed with suspicion and something colder. The stranger's eyes were wary, his jaw set hard. Mark rose unsteadily to his feet, trying to find his voice. I just found them like this, he managed, the words scraping out raw. The man grunted, stepping closer, his gaze never leaving Mark's face. City folk don't usually wander out here at this hour, he said, voice rough as gravel. You chasing trouble or did it find you? His tone held no warmth, just the blunt edge of a man who'd seen too much. Mark swallowed, still blocking the kittens with his body. She's gone, he said quietly. The trap, it killed her. I was trying to call for help, but there's no service. The stranger's eyes flicked down to the lynx, then lingered on the trap, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Poachers, he spat, voice low and bitter, always taking, never caring what they leave behind. For a moment, anger flared in his eyes, but it was directed not at Mark, but at the world outside. The kittens mewled, tiny voices lost in the hush. The older man's features softened, just a fraction. He knelt beside Mark, his presence suddenly less threatening, more tired. Name's Silas, he said, voice a little gentler. Mountain's been my home longer than I care to count. I know these woods. I know what gets left behind. Mark nodded, swallowing his fear, feeling the tension shift between them. He glanced at the phone again. Still no bars. Darkness deepened, the cold biting harder. The woods felt even larger now, and more dangerous, full of things that hunted by night. Silas scanned the trees, rifle across his knees. "We can't stay here," he murmured. "Not with night coming and predators on the move. But there's a ridge half a mile east might catch a signal. I'll keep watch over the kittens. You run like hell and don't look back." The two men met eyes, a silent understanding passing between them, a vow made in the shadow of loss. Mark squeezed the phone tight, knees stiff as he rose. The kittens pressed close to their mother, watching with eyes that had seen too much. Grief burned in Mark's chest, a helpless, howling thing. But he forced himself to turn toward the trees, toward hope, and toward whatever came next in the wild dark. Mark could barely feel his legs as he plunged into the gathering dusk, feet pounding over roots and rocks, heart hammering with something rawer than fear. Behind him, Silas knelt in the shadows, the rifle propped and steady, eyes scanning for any sign of threat, human or beast. The woods swallowed Mark whole. Branches slapped his arms, pine needles caught in his breath. The sharp air stung in his throat. But he ran, driven by a sense of mission he couldn't shake. Every stride felt urgent. Every shadow seemed to watch him. He carried the sound of the kittens mewling with him, their desperate cries threaded through his mind, an ache that kept him from slowing down. The forest pressed close. Out here, every step away from safety was a step deeper into the wild's indifferent heart. He lost his sense of direction almost at once, stumbling over rocks, forced to double back around a tangle of fallen logs. Mark tried to remember Silas's words. Follow the ridge. Look for the open sky. He forced himself to climb, legs burning, hands raw from grabbing branches and stones. The trees thinned, the air grew colder. Dusk was folding fast into night. The blue-black sky shot through with the first faint stars. Mark's phone trembled in his palm, screen smeared with sweat and dirt. He checked for a signal at every clearing, hope rising, then crashing again. No bars, no lifeline, just the blank, indifferent face of technology. Each time he almost gave up. But the thought of the kittens, alone, trembling, orphaned, pushed him on. He pictured Silas standing guard, the old man's steady presence like a promise he couldn't break. Suddenly, a distant cry sliced through the dark, a coyote maybe, or something worse. Mark shuddered, imagining what else prowled the woods. He pressed on, lungs burning. His world shrunk to the small cone of his phone's light and the thudding echo of his own footsteps. Finally, at the crest of a rocky outcrop, the trees broke open. Mark staggered forward, nearly falling to his knees. Wind tore at his hair, the stars above sharp and cold. He raised the phone again, eyes wild with hope, one bar, then two, flickering like a heartbeat. For a split second, he almost wept. He dialed, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. The call rang, then crackled alive, a steady, calm voice on the other end. "Wildlife Rescue, this is Dr. Aris Thorne." Mark's words tumbled out, breathless and broken, telling her about the kittens, the lynx, the trap, the night closing in. Dr. Thorne listened without interruption, her voice an anchor. "Keep your distance from the kittens," she said, firm but not unkind. "We're here to preserve them, not tame them. Can you guide us to the site at first light?" Mark nodded, though she couldn't see. "Yes, there's an old hunter, Silas. He's with them now, but the mother's gone. The trap," his voice cracked. "I understand," Dr. Thorne replied. You did the right thing. Stay put at the ridge if you can. Conserve your light. Keep yourself safe. We'll be there at dawn." The call ended. Mark stood under the indifferent stars, heart pounding with relief and exhaustion. The mountain wind cut through his jacket, but it didn't matter. Help was coming, not just for the kittens, but for the parts of himself he'd left scattered along the trail, raw and open in the face of wild loss. Somewhere below, Silas kept watch in the darkness. Somewhere further still, two wild lives clung to the only comfort left to them. Mark looked up at the sky, letting the cold settle into his bones. The wild had called for help, and for once someone had answered. Dawn was still hours away, but hope, thin and fragile, had found its way through the trees. Mark spent the hours until dawn perched on a bare patch of granite, knees tucked to his chest, jacket zipped tight against the mountain wind. Sleep never came. Only fitful bursts of worry, the cold biting through his layers, and the endless echo of the kitten's cries threading through memory. He stared at his phone, willing the battery to last, watching each minute pass in the faint blue glow. Somewhere down the slope, Silas kept vigil in the darkness, rifle across his lap, shoulders squared against the unknown. Mark trusted the old man, though he hardly knew him. There was a silent language between people who stayed when things got hard, a stubborn, unspoken promise not to let the wild swallow what mattered. As the sky paled to the faintest gray, Mark's thoughts spun between exhaustion and hope. He wondered about the kittens, how they had pressed against their mother's body, refusing to believe she was gone. He thought about his own father, fighting a losing battle against time, the last words they'd exchanged still ringing in his head. He felt as lost as the orphans in the woods, caught between the world that raised him and the wilderness that demanded something different. At first light, headlights wound up the distant service road. Mark scrambled down the ridge, legs stiff, heart leaping at the sight of the wildlife rescue team's battered truck crawling toward the tree line. The team emerged with practiced urgency, 3 figures in forest green jackets, faces set with purpose. Dr. Eris Thorne led them, her calm presence steadying Mark's nerves. She met his eyes with a quiet, measured look. "Show us," she said, her voice neither warm nor cold, but anchored in a kind of purpose that steadied Mark's shaking hands. He led them through the brush, his mind replaying every moment of the night before. Silas stood as they approached, eyes watchful, nodding in grim greeting. The rifle stayed at his side, but his face was tired, drawn with a kind of relief that Mark recognized in himself. Dr. Thorne crouched by the kittens, her movements slow and deliberate. She watched the siblings for a long moment, not reaching out, not speaking, just letting her presence settle. "They're scared," she said softly, "and they're wild. That's how it should be." Her team prepared humane traps, blankets, soft gloves, syringes with mild sedatives. Every movement was careful, respectful, meant to avoid trauma. Mark watched, breath held, as the team worked. The kittens snarled and clawed, tiny bodies blazing with panic and instinct. They fought, refusing capture, their cries sharp and fierce. Mark felt a surge of pride, tinged with heartbreak. The wild in them was alive, untamed, defiant, desperate to survive. Dr. Thorne never rushed. She spoke to Mark in low tones, explaining each step. "Our job isn't to make them pets," she said, eyes never leaving the kittens. "It's to keep them wild, to give them a future beyond human pity. They need space, skill, a world that makes sense to them. You're helping by letting them go, even now." Those words caught Mark off guard. For the first time, he saw the rescue not as an act of ownership, but as a kind of guardianship, a responsibility to do less, to trust nature, to respect the boundaries between worlds. When the kittens were finally sedated and bundled into blankets, Mark saw them glance back one last time. Their gaze lingered on their mother's still form, a goodbye that said everything words could not. Silas rested a hand on Mark's shoulder, his grip firm, steady. For a moment, none of them spoke. The forest held its breath. Mark understood then that he had crossed another threshold, not just into the wild, but into a community of people who refused to look away. He was no longer a bystander. The wild had marked him too, in ways that would never quite fade. And as the rescue truck rumbled to life, hope, wary, battered but unbroken, lit the path out of the forest, shining through the wounds left behind. Dawn broke gold and thin through the upper branches, painting the clearing in pale light. Mark walked at the edge of the group, heart pounding, as Dr. Thorne and her team moved with the calm assurance of people who had learned to meet crisis with patience. Silas moved with them, his gruff silhouette softened in the new day, eyes always on the tree line, rifle carried low and steady. Blankets, gloves, humane traps, and 2 doses of mild sedative, a rescue kit tailored for the wild and wounded. The air was sharp with the scent of pine and something older, grief edged with hope. The kittens huddled together in the tangled grass, their tiny bodies shivering with cold and instinctive fear. They watched every motion with burning eyes, wildness undimmed even after all they'd endured. Dr. Thorne gave quiet instructions. No sudden moves. Let them come if they will. The team worked in silence, moving slow, gentle, giving the orphans space to choose. But hunger and exhaustion wore down the siblings' defiance. When the first kitten lunged, teeth bared, a rescuer caught it in a thick towel. The little creature fought, a flurry of claws, desperate mewling, more force of spirit than strength. The second kitten shrank away, fur bristling, every muscle taut with dread, but there was nowhere left to run. For a tense, aching moment, it seemed the wild would win. The kitten's snarl cut the morning air, sharp and fierce. Mark felt something inside him break and build at the same time, pride and sorrow tangled. But finally, the rescuers worked together, easing the tiny lynx into the safety of a soft-lined carrier, blanket wrapped around trembling sides. A gentle hand delivered the sedative, and the panic faded to wary, stubborn sleep. Silence settled over the clearing. The woods stood witness. Dr. Thorne knelt beside the mother's still form, head bowed. "She fought to the end," she murmured, words for the living as much as the dead. She motioned for the team to give the kittens one last chance to say goodbye. They opened the carrier door for a heartbeat. The siblings pressed forward, noses buried in their mother's fur, eyes closed, bodies shaking with a grief too old for such small hearts. Mark swallowed hard. He wanted to look away, but didn't. This was the cost, and the promise, of caring, the part no one ever tells in rescue stories. The kitten's wildness was not broken by sorrow. If anything, it made their parting braver, a thread connecting what had been lost to whatever fragile hope remained. When it was done, Dr. Thorne stood, her face marked by sleepless nights and hard choices, but her eyes clear. "Let's go," she said softly. Silas gave Mark a slow, solemn nod, a gesture that said everything words could not. A moment later, the team moved out, the carriers swaying gently, the orphans inside finally at rest. Mark looked back once, the clearing now just an empty place shaped by absence, a scrap of wild earth that would keep its secrets and scars. As he followed the team through the forest, the ache in his chest slowly eased. He was not the same man who had stumbled from the road in confusion the night before. Something in him had shifted, opened, caught between grief and gratitude. By the time the rescue truck reached the edge of the woods, the sun was high, the path forward painted in new light. The wild would never truly let him go, he realized. It had claimed a piece of him, just as he had claimed a small place in its endless, wounded story. He watched as the carriers were loaded. The team murmured quiet thanks, and Silas squeezed his shoulder in goodbye. Mark stood for a long moment, letting the forest's hush soak into his bones. Knowing that some stories never really end, they just become part of who you are. Months slipped by, one soft season folding into the next. Mark returned to the city, but the wildness he carried never left him. The world of concrete and glass felt smaller now, his days haunted by memories of mountain wind and the hollow echo of a lynx's cry at dusk. Sometimes, driving home from work, he'd catch a flash of golden fur in his mind's eye and feel again the ache of loss, the stubborn thread of hope. He found himself drawn back to the Wildlife Rescue and Rehabilitation Center again and again. Unable to let the story end at the forest's edge, the center sat nestled in a valley of tall grass and sun-bleached barns, a place humming with quiet purpose. Faded signs lined the walkways, bearing the names of animals that had passed through, each one a story of pain, survival, or healing. The staff welcomed Mark easily, sensing in him the familiar mixture of grief and longing that often followed those who loved the wild. He volunteered for every shift he could manage, hauling feed, repairing fences, washing crates in the pale afternoon sun. But it was the orphaned kittens, now christened Kai and Lyra, names Mark had offered shyly, half worried he was claiming too much, that drew him back most often. They were growing quickly, shedding the look of helpless orphans for the rangy grace of true lynxes. Mark watched through the wire as they practiced their hunting skills, pouncing on feathers and sticks, their wildness undimmed by months of care. The keepers kept their distance, teaching them the boundaries between survival and dependency, their hands gentle but firm. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, Mark would sit just beyond the enclosure's edge, back pressed to the sun-warmed wood, watching Kai and Lyra wrestle in the long grass. Their eyes found him sometimes, a flicker of recognition. Was it gratitude or simply memory? He could never tell. But he realized it didn't matter. The point was not to be their savior, but to be a witness, a thread in the fabric of their return to the wild. The work healed him slowly, in ways he hadn't expected. He began to talk with the other volunteers about their own scars, lost pets, lost parents, the kinds of wounds that never quite faded. In their stories, he found a strange comfort, a sense that the world was bigger than his own sorrow, and that kindness, however small, could bend the shape of things. Back home, his father's health was fading by degrees. Mark's visits grew more frequent, their conversations quieter. Sometimes his father would ask, "Did you leave your mark out there?" Mark would smile, a bittersweet thing, and talk about the lynx kittens, their stubbornness, their hunger, the way wildness refused to be tamed. One day, the center's director found Mark as he was cleaning water bowls. She handed him a worn field guide, the pages full of notes and pressed leaves. "For you," she said. "You've given them more than a name. You've given them a chance." Mark ran his fingers over the names on the enclosure, over Kai and Lyra's fur as they darted past, and felt something loosen inside him. The pain of that night in the woods was still there, a scar running deep, but it no longer owned him. In its place was a quieter ache, one shaped like gratitude and like love. As autumn wind rattled the windows, Mark stood at the edge of the lynx enclosure, the world golden and trembling. Kai and Lyra crouched in the grass, eyes alert, muscles coiled for the life ahead. Mark watched, silent, steady. For the first time, he felt ready to let go, not with regret, but with a hope as wild as the mountains themselves. A year slipped quietly past, the mountain snows coming and going in their old rhythm. Mark's hair had grown longer, a little silver threading through at the temples. His visits to his father's bedside grew more frequent, and their conversations grew softer, full of pauses and unsaid things. On a gentle April morning, with the first light warming the curtains, his father slipped peacefully away, his hand resting quietly in Mark's. The world felt a little emptier, but somehow less afraid. Spring brought new life to the center. The air was rich with the scent of grass and possibility. Kai and Lyra, no longer fragile orphans, had grown sleek and strong, their coats brushed with the gold and ash of their wild mother. They moved with a kind of liquid confidence now, muscles rippling under their fur, eyes bright with purpose. The staff worked carefully, preparing them for what was coming, the long journey back to freedom. On release day, the valley was alive with birdsong. Mark stood with the staff at the edge of a vast, fenced meadow that faded into forest. His heart beat slow and heavy, a deep chord of anticipation and loss. Dr. Thorne unlocked the gate with practiced hands, her eyes meeting Mark's with a silent understanding. "It's time," she said. The carriers opened, and the lynx siblings paused, blinking into the light. For a moment they hesitated. Kai crouched low, Lyra's ears flat, both tense as drawn bows. Then, as if remembering something older than fear, they leapt from the crates, muscles coiling, bodies arrowing across the grass. The two vanished into the trees, a flash of gold and shadow swallowed by the wild. Mark stood unmoving, eyes straining after them long after they'd disappeared. He felt the ache of parting, but not the bitterness of regret. There was pride in it too, and something gentler, a peace he hadn't known he was searching for. He wandered to the edge of the woods, hands in his pockets, breathing the crisp, living air. Somewhere out there, Kai and Lyra would make their own stories. Stories of survival, risk, and wonder. He realized he was no longer their rescuer, just as he was no longer only a son grieving a fading parent. He was something else now, a witness, a guardian at the edge of wildness, a man marked by compassion and loss, both. The rescue team gathered quietly, some sharing hugs, others simply standing, letting the hush of the woods settle over them. Dr. Thorne touched Mark's arm before leaving. "You did well," she said softly. "Their story will ripple further than you know." As the sun drifted higher, Mark found himself alone at the tree line. He knelt where the grass bowed, running his fingers over the fresh earth. The memory of the mother lynx, her courage and sacrifice, was no longer just a wound. It was a legacy, one that would outlast her body, her pain, and even his own grief. Driving home later, Mark watched the mountains recede in the rearview mirror, the sky impossibly wide. The road stretched ahead, not empty now, but threaded with meaning. He thought about all the lives, animal and human, that had intersected for a moment, changed each other, and then gone their separate ways. As he reached the city limits, he carried the wild with him. The hush of dusk in the pines, the stubborn hope in a kitten's eyes, the lessons left by those who loved fiercely and lost bravely. He understood, finally, what it meant to leave a mark, not in monuments or grand gestures, but in the silent work of carrying others forward, honoring what's been lost, and letting go with gratitude. Kai and Lyra's story was no longer just about tragedy. It had become a story of transformation, of heartbreak turned to hope. And as Mark stepped back into the world, he knew he would carry that legacy, quiet and fierce, wherever the road might lead.